Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. My wife and I bought our dream home 3 years ago in what seemed like the perfect neighborhood. The houses were well maintained, the streets were clean, and the community had that small town feel despite being just outside a major city. The only downside, a homeowners association with some of the most ridiculous rules I'd ever seen. When we moved in, we were given a binder, yes, an actual physical binder, filled with HOA regulations that covered everything from acceptable mailbox colors to how many hours you could leave your holiday decorations up. Most of it was standard stuff, albeit overly specific, and we figured we could live with it considering how nice the neighborhood was otherwise. One of my favorite features of our new home was the large stone fireplace in the living room. There's something deeply satisfying about a real wood fire on a cold winter night, and I'd grown up helping my dad chop and stack firewood. To me, it wasn't just about staying warm, it was about continuing a family tradition. That first summer, I invested in a quality chainsaw and spent weekends clearing some dead trees on our property. By fall, I had a substantial stack of seasoned firewood neatly arranged alongside our garage. I even built a small wooden shelter for it to keep the logs dry. It was visible from the street, but it looked neat and tidy. I'd even checked the HOA rules beforehand to make sure there were no restrictions about firewood storage. Then I met Karen. Karen wasn't her real name, of course, but she embodied every stereotype of the entitled, middle-aged woman who believes rules apply to everyone except herself. She'd been on the HOA board for nearly a decade and apparently saw herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. She drove a shiny white SUV with a proud HOA board member sticker on the back window, and she wasn't shy about introducing herself as such. Our first encounter happened on a crisp October afternoon as I was adding the last few logs to my woodpile. "Excuse me," she called from the sidewalk, her voice carrying that fake sweet tone that instantly puts you on edge. "You must be new here." I turned and offered a friendly smile. "Not that new. We moved in last year." She walked up my driveway without waiting for an invitation, clipboard in hand. "Well, I'm Karen Mitchell, HOA board treasurer. I don't believe we've formally met." "Nice to meet you," I replied, extending my hand, which she ignored. "I'm actually here about this." She gestured to my woodpile with a grimace. "It's a bit of an eyesore, don't you think?" I looked at my neatly stacked, carefully covered firewood. "Not really. I built the shelter myself, and I made sure it complies with all the HOA regulations." Karen flipped through some papers on her clipboard. "Well, there's nothing specifically about firewood in the guidelines, but Section 8, Paragraph 3 does state that all exterior features must maintain the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "It's firewood for my fireplace, and it's neatly stacked in a purpose-built shelter that matches our house." "Still," she said with a tight smile, "the board would prefer if you moved it to your backyard where it's not visible from the street." "I'll consider it," I said, not wanting to argue, but also having no intention of moving several cords of wood just to appease this woman's aesthetic sensibilities. Karen seemed satisfied with that response and left with a warning that she'd check back soon to see what I'd decided. I promptly forgot about her request as winter approached and we began enjoying our fireplace regularly. That's when the wood started disappearing. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I could have sworn the stack was higher the day before. Then I started paying attention and realized that every few days the pile would be noticeably smaller, usually by about 10 logs at a time. Initially, I suspected neighborhood kids might be taking it for bonfires, but it seemed odd that they'd keep coming back to the same house repeatedly. My wife suggested maybe it was animals somehow, but that made even less sense. These were heavy oak logs, not something a raccoon could carry off. I decided to set up a trail camera pointed at the woodpile. I'd used these for hunting before and knew they'd capture any movement day or night. Within 3 days, I had my answer. The footage showed Karen, yes, HOA Karen, pulling up in her white SUV in the middle of the afternoon when most people were at work. She'd park in front of our house, calmly walk up to my woodpile, load about 10 logs into a fancy wicker basket, and drive away. She did this twice in 3 days, bold as brass in broad daylight. I was furious. This wasn't just stealing, it was the sheer entitlement of it that got to me. She clearly felt she had every right to take what wasn't hers. That evening, I showed the footage to my wife. "That's insane," she said, watching Karen casually take our property. "Are you going to confront her?" "I think I'll pay her a visit tomorrow," I replied. The next day was Saturday, and I made my way to Karen's house, a large colonial with immaculate landscaping about 3 blocks from ours. As I approached her front door, I noticed something that made my blood boil, a perfectly stacked pile of firewood on her porch that looked suspiciously familiar. I knocked on the door, and Karen answered wearing an apron, looking like she'd stepped out of a Home and Garden magazine. "Oh, hello," she said, clearly surprised to see me. "What can I do for you?" "I think you have something that belongs to me," I said, nodding toward the firewood. Her expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I have you on camera taking firewood from my property on multiple occasions," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That's theft, Karen." For a moment she seemed caught off guard, but she recovered quickly. "Don't be ridiculous, that's community firewood." I blinked, genuinely confused. "Community firewood? There's no such thing. That's wood I cut, split, and stacked myself." "Well," she said with an air of superiority, "the HOA board decided that since your wood pile is an eyesore, it should be redistributed for the benefit of the neighborhood. I've been taking some to elderly residents who can't cut their own wood." This was such a blatant lie that I almost laughed. First of all, there's nothing in the HOA rules that gives you the right to take my property. Second, I've watched the footage. You're bringing it to your own house. "Some of it goes to my house," she admitted without a hint of shame. "I am doing a community service, after all." "Karen, this is theft. Plain and simple. I want my wood back, and I want you to stop taking it. Otherwise, I'll file a police report and press charges." Her face hardened. "You wouldn't dare. Do you know how that would look? Suing your HOA board treasurer over a few pieces of firewood? I'm not suing anyone, I'm reporting a theft. Multiple thefts, actually." Karen's husband appeared in the hallway behind her. "What's going on, honey?" She turned to him. "Nothing, dear. Just a misunderstanding about the community outreach program." I spoke up before she could spin more lies. "Sir, your wife has been stealing firewood from my property. I have it on camera. I'm here to ask her to stop and return what she's taken." He looked genuinely confused. "What community outreach program?" "Never mind that," Karen snapped at him before turning back to me. "Look, I'll bring back what I have left, but I think you're making a mountain out of a molehill. It's just firewood." "It's the principle," I insisted. "And yes, I expect you to return what you haven't burned. I also expect you to never take anything from my property again." She agreed with obvious reluctance, and I left feeling frustrated but hoping the matter was resolved. It wasn't. She did bring back about half of what she'd taken, dropping it unceremoniously in a pile on our driveway rather than stacking it properly. But a week later, my camera caught her at it again, this time coming at dusk and taking fewer logs, probably hoping I wouldn't notice. I was beyond angry now. I sent her the new footage via email with a clear warning that the next time she took my wood, I would go straight to the police and the rest of the HOA board. She replied with a terse message claiming she thought those were community logs I'd put out separately from my main pile. Another obvious lie. The next community meeting was the following week, and I decided to bring it up publicly. As the meeting was wrapping up, I raised my hand during the open forum. "I have a question about HOA policy," I said when called on. "Is there any provision that allows board members to take property from residents' yards without permission?" The room went silent. Karen, sitting at the board table, turned crimson. The HOA president, an older gentleman named Frank, looked confused. "No, of course not. Why do you ask?" I explained the situation briefly, mentioning that I had video evidence but not naming Karen directly, though everyone knew who I was talking about from her reaction. Frank frowned deeply. "That's completely unacceptable and not HOA-sanctioned behavior. If someone is taking your property, that's a police matter, not an HOA issue." Karen tried to interject with some explanation about community resources and helping the elderly, but Frank shut her down. "We'll discuss this in our executive session," he told her firmly before addressing me again. "I apologize for this situation. Please be assured the board does not condone theft of any kind." I thought that would be the end of it. Surely after being publicly exposed, Karen would leave my firewood alone. I was wrong again. 2 weeks later, after a heavy snowfall, I caught her on camera yet again. This time she came at night, with a flashlight, taking a larger quantity than ever before. The footage showed her making 3 trips to her car, loading it with as much wood as she could carry each time. That was it. I'd had enough of playing nice. It was time for some creative revenge. I had a buddy who worked in pest control, and over beers one night I explained my situation. He laughed at the audacity of this woman and offered a suggestion that would become my sweet revenge. "I've got some logs from a recent termite job," he said. "They're completely hollowed out, like natural termite condos. They're safe to handle, but if they're brought indoors and kept warm, the dormant termites will wake up and start looking for new wood to infest. A plan formed in my mind. "How many of these logs do you have?" "About a dozen. Was going to use them for a demonstration at a conference, but I can get more." "Why?" I smiled. "I think I might have a use for them." The next weekend, I carefully arranged my new special logs at the top of my woodpile, making them the easiest ones to grab. They looked just like regular logs on the outside, maybe even a bit more attractive than my usual oak. I set my camera up as usual and waited. Karen didn't disappoint. 3 days later, with another cold snap in the forecast, she made her move. The camera caught her pulling up after dark, tiptoeing to my woodpile and, just as I'd hoped, selecting the easily accessible logs on top. My special delivery. She took all 12 termite logs plus a few regular ones, loading them into her car with an air of entitlement that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. I knew it would take time for the termites to become active and spread, so I tried to be patient. In the meantime, I reinforced my woodpile with a small lock and chain. Not enough to completely prevent theft if someone was determined, but enough to make it clear that the wood wasn't free for the taking. About 3 weeks later, I noticed unusual activity at Karen's house. A large truck with Premier Pest Control painted on the side was parked in her driveway. Over the next few days, more service vehicles appeared. Another pest control company, then a construction truck. The neighborhood gossip network worked its magic, and soon everyone knew. Karen had a massive termite infestation. Apparently, it had started in her living room, specifically in the decorative basket of firewood she kept next to her fireplace, and had spread to her hardwood floors and even some of the structural beams in her walls. I didn't gloat openly, but I couldn't help feeling a sense of satisfaction when I overheard her complaining to another neighbor at the mailboxes. "The exterminator said it's the worst case he's seen in years," she lamented. "We might have to move out for weeks while they treat the house. And the damage..." She trailed off, looking genuinely distressed. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt. I hadn't intended to cause such extensive damage to her home. But then again, I had warned her multiple times to stop stealing from me, and she'd ignored every warning with a sense of entitlement that was truly breathtaking. The final chapter of this saga came about a month later at another HOA meeting. Karen wasn't present. She and her husband were apparently staying at a hotel while their house was being treated and partially rebuilt. Frank, the HOA president, announced that Karen had resigned from the board for personal reasons. After the meeting, Frank approached me in the parking lot. "Strange thing about Karen's termite problem," he said casually. "Pest control said it was unusual to see an infestation that severe start so suddenly, especially in winter." I kept my expression neutral. "That is strange." "The technician mentioned it seemed to originate from firewood brought into the house," Frank continued, giving me a knowing look. "Apparently that's a common way for termites to spread." I met his gaze but said nothing. After a moment, Frank smiled slightly. "Well, I suppose there's a lesson in all this about respecting other people's property." "I suppose so," I agreed. He nodded and walked away, leaving me to wonder how much he had figured out. "I never told anyone except my wife about what I'd done, and we've sworn each other to secrecy. The cost to Karen was undoubtedly high, both financially and in terms of convenience. But I can't bring myself to feel too bad about it. She had multiple opportunities to stop stealing from me, and she chose to continue, believing her position on the HOA board somehow placed her above the rules. My woodpile remains untouched by anyone but me these days, and I've noticed a strange new respect from other HOA board members. The ridiculous complaints about aesthetic harmony have stopped completely, and no one bothers me about my neat stack of firewood anymore. As for Karen, she and her husband finally moved back into their house after nearly 2 months of remediation work. She avoids eye contact whenever we cross paths, and I've heard she's far less eager to enforce HOA rules these days. I consider it a lesson well learned. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms, like tiny wood-eating insects that teach entitled HOA Karens not to take what isn't theirs. Edit. Wow, I didn't expect this post to blow up like it did. To address some common questions. 1. Yes, I know introducing termites could have potentially affected other homes. My pest control buddy assured me the specific termites used were a species that need very precise conditions to thrive and spread, namely being brought indoors and kept warm. The risk to other properties was minimal. 2. No, I don't feel guilty. She stole from me repeatedly after multiple warnings. 3. For those asking about legal implications, what I did was definitely in a gray area legally and ethically. I wouldn't recommend anyone else try this specific form of revenge. There are better ways to handle HOA disputes. 4. And for those concerned about the ecological impact, these were already existing termites from an infested property, not a new colony introduced to the environment. Thanks for all the comments and support. Update 6 months later. I didn't plan on providing an update to this story, but things have taken some interesting turns in the past 6 months that I thought were worth sharing. First off, Karen and her husband finally finished all their home repairs about 3 months ago. Their insurance covered most of the damage, but I heard through neighborhood gossip that they still had to pay over $20,000 out of pocket because the insurance adjuster determined the infestation was due to homeowner negligence, specifically bringing untreated firewood inside the house. The irony still makes me smile. About a month after they moved back in, I was out front splitting some new logs when a black pickup truck pulled into my driveway. To my surprise, it was Karen's husband, Dave. I tensed up, preparing for a confrontation, but his demeanor wasn't hostile. "Got a minute?" he asked as he stepped out of his truck. "Sure," I replied cautiously, setting my axe down. Dave looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Look, I know what happened with our termite problem wasn't a coincidence." My heart rate picked up, but I kept my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "Let's not dance around it," he said with a tired sigh. "Karen told me everything. About taking your firewood, I mean. She tried to hide it from me at first. Said she was getting it from a community pile somewhere. But after you came to our house that day, I started paying attention." I stayed silent, letting him talk. "I saw her sneaking out at night to get more wood from your pile. I confronted her about it, but she just got defensive, said it was her right as an HOA board member to redistribute resources or some nonsense." He shook his head. "I wanted to apologize for her behavior. It was wrong, plain and simple." This was unexpected. "I appreciate that," I said. "But why are you telling me this now?" Dave ran a hand through his hair. "Because I know those termites didn't just magically appear in our firewood basket. And while I can't prove anything, I have my suspicions." My muscles tensed again. Was this a threat? But Dave surprised me. "And honestly, I don't blame you. Karen's been, difficult for years, not just with neighbors, with everyone. This whole termite disaster has been a wake-up call for us." "How so?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Well, for one thing, we're in marriage counseling now. The stress of being displaced from our home for months finally forced us to address some long-standing issues." He looked me in the eye. "And for another, I made her resign from the HOA board. It wasn't good for her or for the neighborhood." I nodded slowly, not sure what to say. "Anyway," Dave continued, "I just wanted you to know that I understand why someone might have been pushed to extreme measures and to assure you there won't be any retaliation or legal action. We're trying to move forward." "I appreciate that," I said carefully. He nodded. "Oh, and one more thing." He reached into his truck and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you. Consider it restitution for the stolen firewood." I took the envelope, opened it, and found 5 $100 bills inside. "That should cover what she took, plus some," Dave said. "Karen doesn't know I'm doing this, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." "This isn't necessary," I said, trying to hand it back. Dave pushed my hand away. "Yes, it is. What's right is right." As he drove away, I stood there with the envelope, feeling a mix of vindication and, surprisingly, a little sympathy for Dave. He seemed like a decent guy stuck with a Karen. The next HOA meeting was interesting, to say the least. With Karen gone, Frank, the HOA president, had appointed a younger woman named Melissa to fill the vacant board position. The difference was night and day. Where Karen had been obsessed with trivial rule enforcement, Melissa focused on community improvements and reasonable compromise. At that meeting, Frank announced a complete overhaul of the HOA regulations. "Over the years," he said, "our rules have become unnecessarily complicated and, in some cases, unreasonably restrictive. The board has unanimously voted to simplify and modernize our approach. The revised rulebook was half the size of the original binder. Gone were the ridiculous restrictions about exact shades of acceptable house colors and the micromanagement of landscaping choices. Instead, the new guidelines focused on maintaining basic standards while respecting homeowners' right to reasonable self-expression. The best part, the new rules included a specific provision about firewood storage. Neatly stacked firewood in good condition is permitted on private property, provided it is properly covered and maintained." After the meeting, Frank approached me with a smile. "I hope the new firewood provision meets with your approval," he said with a knowing wink. "It does," I replied. "Thanks for being reasonable about it. Between you and me," Frank lowered his voice, "Karen's departure from the board was long overdue. She's been driving everyone crazy for years, but nobody wanted to be the one to stand up to her." "Glad I could help," I said with a straight face. Frank chuckled. "You know, we're looking for more level-headed people to join the Architectural Review Committee. Someone with a sense of proportion and fairness. Would you be interested?" I was surprised by the offer, but found myself genuinely considering it. I might be, I said. Let me think about it. 2 weeks later, I accepted the position, figuring the best way to prevent HOA overreach was to be part of the process. So far, it's been a positive experience. I've helped approve reasonable requests that Karen would have shot down, and I've worked with homeowners to find compromises when their initial plans didn't quite fit the guidelines. As for Karen herself, she's kept a remarkably low profile since moving back in. I still see her around the neighborhood, but she crosses the street to avoid me. Recently, though, I noticed something surprising. She's started stacking her own firewood pile in her backyard. Properly, I might add, with a good cover and raised off the ground. I guess some lessons do stick. Dave stops by occasionally, usually with a 6-pack of beer, and we've developed an unlikely friendship. He's actually a pretty handy guy and has helped me build a more secure wood storage shed, one with a proper lock this time. He never explicitly acknowledges what I did with the termites, and I never admit to it, but there's an unspoken understanding between us. Last week, he helped me split a new cord of wood for the upcoming winter, and as we worked, he mentioned they're considering selling their house and moving closer to his family in Colorado. Karen needs a fresh start, he explained. Somewhere she's not known as the termite lady or the HOA tyrant. I felt a twinge of guilt at that, but only a twinge. Actions have consequences after all. The neighborhood has changed for the better since the Great Termite Incident, as some neighbors jokingly call it, though never to Karen's face. The HOA is more reasonable. Property values have actually increased due to the more relaxed atmosphere attracting new buyers, and people are friendlier with each other now that they're not constantly worried about getting cited for trivial violations. My firewood remains untouched by anyone but me, though I've started a small community woodpile at the neighborhood park, with official HOA approval of course, where people can take a few logs if they're having a fire pit gathering or need some kindling. It was actually Frank's idea, and it's been a hit with the neighbors. A small gesture of goodwill that helps bring the community together. Sometimes I look back on the whole incident and wonder if I went too far. But then I remember Karen's entitled attitude, the way she repeatedly stole from me despite multiple warnings, and her complete lack of remorse until faced with consequences. I don't regret teaching her that lesson. In the end, my termite revenge did more than just stop a thief. It sparked positive change throughout the neighborhood. Sometimes it takes knocking down a few walls to build something better, or in this case, letting some tiny insects do the demolition for you. The firewood pile by my garage stands tall and undisturbed, a monument to standing up for yourself when someone crosses the line. And if the occasional neighbor asks me about the heavy-duty lock on my new wood shed, I just smile and say, you can never be too careful these days. You never know what might be hiding in your wood pile. The next one is a malicious compliances story. This happened many years ago. I worked for a top U.S. banking institution. In our building, all of the other departments were allowed to wear blue jeans on Fridays. My manager decided that our department had to wear business attire on Fridays. To be clear, we had no customer-facing presence. Also, our department processes check deposits from ATMs, and they came in mesh bags from the armored couriers. They were usually quite filthy and were frequently wet in bad weather. So when our manager told us that we couldn't wear blue jeans on Fridays like every other department, the entire team was upset. Here is where we cue the malicious compliance. The next Friday, I went to my closet and found the most mismatched outfit I could put together, sticking completely to business attire. We are talking pastel floral print shirt with pants with bold-colored stripes. I put it on and proudly walked into the office. My manager just happened to be on vacation that week, so nothing was said about my ridiculously mismatched outfit. Fast forward to the next Friday, I, once again, chose the most hideous combination of an outfit that I could put together. Once again, I walked into the office with my head held high, confident in my business attire. Imagine my surprise when I walked in and everyone on my team had on hideous combinations of clothing. As you can imagine, my boss walks in and sees everyone in their various hideous outfits. The look on her face was priceless. All 15 of us in hideous outfits, but all meeting the business attire dress code. She pulled us all into a meeting and told us that our attire was entirely inappropriate for a business environment and that she would have to write each and every one of us up. I asked her to pull out the company handbook and read the definition of what it said as business attire. She read it, and it stated something like clean and pressed business attire consisting of slacks, skirts, or dresses, and clean pressed shirts or blouses. It went on to say something like no blue jeans, t-shirts, ripped, or clothes with holes, no sleeveless shirts, and no athletic or gym shoes. I asked her where in the guidelines does it say anything about whether the outfits matched or not. She couldn't find anything and said she would have to contact HR to discuss with them what her options were to write us up. Needless to say, none of us were ever written up. She did, however, say we still needed to dress in business attire. Word quickly spread to other departments about her forcing us to wear business attire. The next week, 2 departments around us decided that they would also dress up in hideously matched clothing. The managers of those departments quickly got in touch with our manager and put pressure on her as they didn't like how their employees were dressing. Our manager called us into a meeting and told us we could wear blue jeans on Fridays going forward. Malicious compliance wins. Sometime later, I will tell you about the sign-in/sign-out board she created. The next one is an entitled People's Story. My sister is the worst person I've ever met in my life, and while I'm no expert in diagnosing people, I'm pretty sure she's a covert narcissist. Though it's certainly not covert anymore, and I intend to write many posts about her in time. This one just happened to be the story I thought to start with. I will say in advance that my sister's husband did divorce her, and eventually took full custody of the kids later as well. This story I'm about to tell happened around 7 years ago. Back then, my sister had destroyed her own marriage with a mixture of infidelity and narcissism. She still thinks I don't know she was a cheater because she cried to me for years that she doesn't do that, and cheating is a deal breaker for her. But she had 3 different affairs that I know of, one with a cousin of ours. Anyway, she split from her husband and they sold their house. She then ended up living out of an old 30-foot trailer on the family property next to the sub-building I live out of. Her children were all extremely undisciplined and made us miserable. My sister also refused to get a job. When confronted, she'd cry and say it would just be till her kids were back in school. Well, her kids went back to school and she still didn't get a job, and would cry again if confronted. Then she ended up begging her husband to get back together with her by calling him up in tears because she was broke, but she lied to everyone else and said that didn't happen. She did finally get a job, and she obviously hated it, but pretended to like it for years. My sister's ex tried to give their marriage one more chance and moved into the trailer with her, but she made him miserable for over a year. He bought her a pug puppy because she wanted a dog, then she wanted another dog, so he decided to get a German Shepherd since he wanted a dog he could enjoy too. She did not like that dog, so he ended up getting her another pug too, and those pugs crapped everywhere. Then one day, the refrigerator in the trailer started malfunctioning, and its days were clearly numbered. My brother-in-law went out to a used appliance store and got both a refurbished refrigerator and microwave bundled together. Then, he and the delivery guy had a hell of a time getting it out and installing it. On top of that, he bought all new fresh food for the new refrigerator and packed it full of good stuff. He was practically beaming to see her come home and see the new fridge. But not only was she completely ungrateful, she was angry. My sister came home from work, and her reaction to the new fridge was initially completely emotionless, like she had ice in her veins. And then she suddenly stomped forward, opened the new fridge, and said, "Where's my food?" There was never any sort of thank you from her. She just demanded to know where the old food was. We found out years later she was an expired food HOA. Among other things, she had an unopened large bottle of ketchup that was so old the contents had turned brown. And she was feeding crap like that to her kids. My sister's husband was so upset she wasn't happy with the new fridge that he just gave up trying to please her. And eventually he left again. He bought a new house for himself, and that's where all of my nephews and his current girlfriend all live. And he's doing great as a dad. But my sister eventually lost everything, and she blames everyone but herself. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.